The North African sun hung merciless over the Tunisian wasteland on that December morning in 1942, the kind of heat that made mirages dance on distant dunes and turned metal equipment hot enough to brand skin. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim stood in his command post observation area, his uniform already stained with sweat despite the early hour, as he lifted those familiar Zeiss optics to his eyes. What he witnessed through those lenses would challenge every assumption he had made about his adversary's capabilities and resources. The American column appeared first as a shimmer, an undefined mass moving across the terrain with unusual speed and agility. Von Arnim had fought across 3 fronts by this point in the conflict, and he knew what military columns were supposed to look like. They moved with ponderous weight, heavy machinery grinding forward in organized rows, tanks and armored vehicles proceeding with mechanical determination. But these vehicles defied expectation. They weren't the hulking Sherman tanks he had studied in intelligence briefings, weren't the half-tracks or armored personnel carriers that German reconnaissance had predicted would form the backbone of American mobile forces. Instead, what materialized from the heat waves were hundreds upon hundreds of small, almost comically compact vehicles, each one bouncing and weaving across the rocky desert floor with an energy that seemed entirely inappropriate for military equipment. They swarmed rather than marched, scattered across the landscape like a colony of mechanical ants, each one kicking up its own separate plume of dust as it navigated the uneven terrain. The vehicles were open-topped, exposed, their occupants clearly visible even from this distance, and they moved with such apparent carelessness that von Arnim's first instinct was to dismiss them as some sort of auxiliary force, perhaps civilian contractors or supply personnel who had somehow gotten ahead of the main combat units. The lieutenant standing beside him voiced what many in the German command were thinking, muttering something about toy cars, children's playthings, his tone mixing mockery with genuine bewilderment. But von Arnim was a seasoned enough officer to recognize when his initial assumptions might be dangerously wrong. He kept those field glasses pressed to his face, tracking the movement of these strange little machines, watching how they maneuvered, observing their speed and the apparent ease with which they handled terrain that would have slowed or stopped many conventional military vehicles. There was something unsettling about their ubiquity, their sheer numbers. They were everywhere, scattered across every available route of approach, moving independently, yet somehow maintaining coordinated progress toward their objectives. This wasn't chaos or disorganization. This was something entirely different, a new kind of military mobility that German doctrine hadn't prepared him to understand. He was watching, though he didn't fully grasp it yet, the vehicle that would come to represent American military philosophy more completely than any other single piece of equipment in the entire war. The Willys MB, universally known by that peculiar nickname that seemed to mean everything and nothing at once, the Jeep. By the time the last shot was fired in this global catastrophe, American industrial might would have churned out nearly 650,000 of these machines, an almost incomprehensible number that translated to one of these vehicles for roughly every 50 men who wore the American uniform during those years of conflict. For German generals, men who had been raised in a military culture that still relied heavily on animal transport, who commanded armies where horse-drawn wagons remained a primary means of moving supplies, who operated under constant fuel rationing and chronic vehicle shortages. These numbers existed beyond the realm of possibility. Their logistics networks struggled constantly with the basic challenges of mobility, pressing civilian trucks into military service, requisitioning anything with wheels and an engine, and in the brutal Eastern campaigns against the Soviets, frequently falling back on the most primitive transport method of all, teams of oxen pulling carts through mud and snow. The contrast could not have been more stark or more demoralizing. Here they faced an enemy who had developed and deployed a vehicle so fundamentally simple, so remarkably cheap to produce, so astonishingly reliable in operation, that it had essentially transformed every small unit into a mobile fighting force, every platoon into a mechanized element capable of independent rapid movement across any terrain. The intelligence assessments that had crossed von Arnim's desk before this moment had characterized the Jeep as impractical, a typically American excess, a wasteful gimmick that diverted resources from serious military hardware. Those assessments had been catastrophically, dangerously incorrect, and the price of that miscalculation was now becoming painfully apparent on battlefields from North Africa to the Pacific Islands. The story of how this unassuming machine came into existence begins months before Pearl Harbor in the summer of 1940, when the United States Army, watching with growing alarm as Europe descended into mechanized warfare, issued what seemed like an impossible challenge to American industry. They wanted a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle, something nimble and fast, but it had to have four-wheel drive capability for rough terrain. It couldn't weigh more than 1,300 pounds. It needed to be capable of carrying a mounted machine gun and crew. It had to climb grades as steep as 60%. And despite all these constraints, it still needed to be capable of hitting 50 miles per hour on open roads. The specifications seemed deliberately contradictory, asking for a vehicle that was simultaneously light and rugged, fast and capable, simple and sophisticated. Most American automotive companies looked at the requirements and politely declined to submit proposals. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable given the time frame and budget constraints. Only two manufacturers possessed either the desperation or the vision to attempt the impossible. American Bantam, a small company teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, saw the contract as a potential lifeline and threw themselves into development with nothing to lose. Willys Overland, another company struggling through the Depression years, recognized that their engineering expertise in small engines might give them an advantage in this unusual competition. Bantam moved fastest, producing the first working prototype that demonstrated the basic concept could actually function, but it was Willys who refined and perfected the design, building around their remarkable Go Devil engine, a 60-horsepower marvel of compact engineering that gave this squat little vehicle surprising pulling power and unexpected resilience under sustained operation. Then Ford Motor Company, that industrial titan with its massive production capabilities, entered the picture not as a designer, but as a manufacturer, preparing to stamp out these vehicles by the thousands using their legendary assembly line methods. Ford marked nearly every component they produced with a distinctive F, creating a standardization so complete that American soldiers would joke, with only slight exaggeration, that you could pull a bolt from a Jeep built in Michigan, thread it into a hole on a Jeep built in a different facility entirely, and it would fit perfectly without hesitation or modification. When German officers eventually captured one of these vehicles and examined it closely, they were genuinely astonished to discover that the parts were not only interchangeable, but actually numbered and organized according to a logical system that made field repairs dramatically simpler. This represented a philosophy completely alien to German engineering culture, where vehicles were often hand-fitted during assembly, where parts from one machine might not precisely match corresponding components in another supposedly identical vehicle, where maintenance required skilled mechanics familiar with the peculiarities of individual machines, rather than standardized procedures that any moderately trained soldier could follow. By 1942, American production facilities had achieved a rhythm that defied belief. One complete Jeep rolled off assembly lines somewhere in the United States every 2 minutes, day and night, week after week, month after month. To truly comprehend the industrial scale involved, consider what was happening at Ford's massive Rouge plant in Michigan, that cathedral of American manufacturing where raw materials entered one end and finished vehicles emerged from the other in an unbroken stream of productivity. At peak production, that single facility was completing 100 Jeeps every hour, operating continuously around the clock 7 days a week. In the time it took German factories to handcraft one complex staff car with its careful finishing and custom details, American plants were churning out dozens of these standardized utilitarian vehicles. The comparison wasn't just embarrassing for German industrial planners, it represented a fundamental difference in manufacturing philosophy and capability that had profound strategic implications. The Germans built vehicles like craftsmen. Americans built them like commodities, and in total war, commodities win. But the Jeep's genius extended far beyond mere production numbers. This wasn't just a vehicle that could be built quickly and cheaply, though those qualities were certainly important. What made it truly revolutionary was its capability across nearly every conceivable type of terrain and condition. The four-wheel drive system, combined with a suspension design using flexible leaf springs, meant this machine could tackle obstacles and surfaces that would stop conventional vehicles cold. Deep mud that would trap wheeled transport became merely an inconvenience for the Jeep, its four-driven wheels and relatively light weight allowing it to maintain traction and forward momentum. Snow and ice, the great equalizers that had stalled so many military advances throughout history, became navigable terrain. Desert sand, which could bog down heavier vehicles until their differentials buried themselves in the dunes, yielded to the Jeep's combination of power and light footprint. Jungle tracks barely wide enough for a man on foot became viable supply routes when a Jeep could squeeze through the vegetation. The vehicle could ford streams and shallow rivers, water splashing over the hood and into the open cabin while the engine kept running and the wheels kept turning. It could climb embankments that looked impossibly steep, the four-wheel drive and low gearing combining to pull the vehicle up slopes that would have rolled a conventional car backward. Its turning radius was tighter than anything in the German motor pool, allowing it to navigate narrow streets in bombed-out towns, to reverse direction on mountain roads where a larger vehicle would have needed a 5-point turn to maneuver in tight quarters that would trap less agile machines. Soldiers, those endlessly creative problem solvers who have always adapted military equipment to unexpected purposes, quickly realized they weren't just driving a transport vehicle. They had been handed something more versatile, more adaptable, something that could be modified and repurposed for dozens of different roles that its original designers had never imagined. They welded stretcher racks to the hood and sides, transforming Jeeps into frontline ambulances that could reach wounded men in positions no conventional ambulance could access, bouncing across cratered battlefields to deliver medical care within minutes of injury. They mounted additional steel plates as improvised armor, creating what they called gun jeeps, mobile firing platforms with heavy machine guns, or even small artillery pieces that could dash to a firing position, unleash devastating firepower, and retreat before enemy artillery could range them. They stretched the chassis, extending the frame to create specialized variants, including vehicles that could run on railroad tracks, transforming the Jeep into a versatile railroad trolley for reconnaissance missions along captured rail lines. Perhaps most audaciously, American airborne forces developed techniques to strap Jeeps to gliders, creating packages of mobility that could be dropped behind enemy lines, giving paratroopers immediate mechanized transport capability from the moment they landed in hostile territory. One fact that particularly astonished German intelligence analysts when they discovered it in 1942 was the scale of the Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union. The United States was sending Jeeps to their communist allies by the tens of thousands, more than 50,000 of these vehicles shipped across dangerous ocean routes to Russian ports, then distributed to Red Army units who praised them with unusual enthusiasm for foreign equipment. Soviet generals, not known for complimenting anything that didn't originate in Moscow, called the Jeep superior to their own light vehicle designs, creating a nickname that translated roughly as the American Mule, a reference to its reliability and work capacity. At Stalingrad, where the most brutal urban combat of the war ground entire armies into dust and blood, some Red Army artillery units deployed Jeeps as forward observation vehicles, using their speed and maneuverability to dash through rubble-choked streets and establish spotting positions for the feared Katyusha rocket batteries. German troops defending among the ruins found themselves under rocket bombardment guided by vehicles that looked like civilian runabouts, an incongruity that added psychological insult to the physical devastation of the barrage. In North Africa, where Erwin Rommel led the famous Afrika Korps in dramatic sweeps across the desert, the German commander personally noted the disparity in mobility between his forces and the Americans. Rommel's supply situation was chronically desperate, his units dependent on captured British vehicles whose parts and fuel they could barely maintain. supplemented by German transport that was never designed for desert conditions and broke down constantly when sand infiltrated their complex mechanical systems. Meanwhile, American jeeps skipped across the dunes with apparent ease, delivering ammunition and water to forward units, evacuating wounded, repositioning machine gun teams, maintaining communication between separated elements, all at speeds and across terrain that German vehicles simply could not match. A staff report from early 1943, captured after the final collapse of Axis forces in Tunisia, recorded with barely suppressed frustration that the enemy possessed a small motor vehicle capable of sustaining long marches while carrying men and equipment across terrain that German machines could not cross, and that their mobility exceeded German capabilities in every measurable category. The tone of the report conveyed not just tactical concern, but a deeper unease, a recognition that they were confronting an adversary who had solved problems of military logistics in ways that German engineering and industrial culture had not conceived. The psychological impact of the Jeep was as significant as its mechanical capabilities, perhaps even more so in certain contexts. German officers had been raised in a military tradition that emphasized grandeur and impressiveness in military equipment, where the psychological effect of a weapon was considered as important as its practical function. War machines were supposed to be grand, imposing, even beautiful in a terrible way. Massive tanks with thick armor and powerful guns, sleek aircraft with elegant lines and roaring engines, artillery pieces that dominated the landscape with their size and the thunder of their firing. The Jeep looked absurd by these standards, almost laughably small and simple, more like a civilian recreational vehicle than serious military hardware. Yet this very unpretentiousness concealed its genius, made it easy to underestimate, until the cumulative effect of thousands upon thousands of them became impossible to ignore. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander who coordinated the massive multinational forces that crushed the Third Reich, would later identify the Jeep as one of the three most decisive weapons of the entire war, placing it alongside the C-47 transport aircraft that enabled airborne operations and strategic mobility, and the specialized landing craft that made amphibious invasions possible on an unprecedented scale. When von Arnim's staff officers attempted to calculate the actual number of jeeps supporting American operations in Tunisia, they initially concluded that the intelligence reports must be inflated, that someone had made an error in translation or transcription, because surely no country would allocate so many resources to producing such large quantities of what appeared to be minor support vehicles. But at that very moment, as German analysts were dismissing the numbers as impossible, American supply ships were unloading thousands more jeeps at ports in Algiers and Oran, each vehicle packed efficiently into a wooden crate like some sort of military toy, ready to be assembled and deployed within hours of arrival. This was another aspect of the Jeep that German logistics officers found difficult to believe even when confronted with evidence. A Jeep could be completely disassembled, packed into a standardized wooden shipping crate that protected it during ocean transport, then reassembled by a team of 4 moderately skilled men in less than an hour, emerging from the crate as a fully functional vehicle ready for immediate combat service. United States quartermasters loved this modularity, the way it simplified shipping calculations and maximized the use of cargo space. German supply officers, reading reports describing vehicles arriving in boxes and being assembled like furniture, dismissed these accounts as Allied propaganda, assuming no functional motor vehicle could possibly be designed for such treatment. In truth, the Jeep's modular construction made it the most deployable vehicle in military history, able to be shipped anywhere in the world and put into service faster than any competitor. The shock that German officers experienced when encountering this American logistics capability only deepened as the war progressed into Europe. After the Normandy landings in June 1944, when Allied forces finally opened the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe, Jeeps became the visible arteries of the advancing armies, the physical manifestation of American industrial power rolled out across the European countryside. They carried generals like George Patton, that aggressive tank commander who embodied the American preference for speed and audacity, riding in his jeep to personally scout ahead of his columns and maintain that legendary close contact with his forward units. They carried medics under fire, racing through artillery barrages to reach the wounded, the red cross markings on their hoods and sides their only protection against the storm of steel. They carried chaplains conducting field services, the vehicle serving as a mobile pulpit where men about to enter battle could receive whatever spiritual comfort their faith tradition offered. They even carried Hollywood celebrities like Clark Gable, that embodiment of American glamour and confidence, touring the front lines to boost morale, his presence made possible by the same vehicle that carried ammunition and wounded soldiers. German prisoners, marched to the rear in long columns under guard, walked past what seemed like endless parking lots of jeeps, vehicles lined up nose to tail as far as the eye could see, an unbroken river of olive-drab steel and rubber that represented a level of material abundance they had never witnessed in their own military service. To these captured soldiers, trudging on foot while their captors rode in motorized comfort, it appeared as though America had simply decided to provide every single soldier with his own personal automobile, an extravagance so extreme it seemed almost insulting. One captured letter that German censors intercepted before it could be mailed home contained a passage where a soldier wrote to his wife describing the surreal experience, noting that the Americans drove to war as if going on holiday, that even their junior officers rode in open vehicles while German soldiers marched on foot, and concluding with the bitter observation that it wasn't fair, that it couldn't possibly be sustainable, that no nation could maintain such lavish logistics indefinitely. But the soldier was wrong about sustainability because he didn't understand the system he was observing. This was industrial democracy in action, the application of American manufacturing principles to military logistics on a scale no previous conflict had ever witnessed. The Jeep's fundamental simplicity meant that essentially anyone could operate it effectively, anyone could perform basic maintenance, anyone could understand its systems well enough to keep it running under field conditions. A farmer drafted from Kansas who had never driven anything more complex than a tractor could diagnose carburetor problems with nothing more than basic pliers and common sense. A teenager from Brooklyn with no mechanical background could swap out a transmission in the middle of a muddy field, following straightforward procedures that required more determination than specialized skill. Spare parts flowed through the supply system so freely that American mechanics sometimes built complete vehicles from leftover components and damaged Jeeps cannibalized for parts, creating what they called Frankenstein Jeeps that combined pieces from multiple sources into functioning machines. German generals, trapped in an economic system where chronic shortages affected every aspect of military operations, where even basic spare parts required paperwork and approval processes, where improvisation was discouraged by regulations and cultural expectations about proper procedure, could only observe this American abundance with a mixture of envy and disbelief. By the war's conclusion, Jeeps appeared literally everywhere the conflict touched. They bounced across the Normandy beaches on D-Day, following immediately behind the assault waves to establish command posts and communication networks while the fighting still raged at the waterline. They navigated the narrow roads between Italian vineyards, bringing supplies to infantry units fighting their way up the peninsula against determined German resistance in terrain that favoured defence. They drove through Burmese jungles in the China-Burma-India theatre, that often forgotten front where Allied forces fought to keep supply routes open to China through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. They appeared on remote Pacific islands, where CB construction battalions strapped them to improvised barges and drove them directly onto beaches to support Marine Corps operations against Japanese defenders. They pulled artillery pieces into firing positions, their lightweight and four-wheel drive allowing them to position guns in locations that heavier tow vehicles couldn't reach. They carried portable radar sets to forward observation posts, extending the Allied forces' electronic surveillance capabilities. They hauled mail to forward units, maintaining the crucial psychological connection between soldiers and home. They delivered generals to surrender ceremonies, serving as the command transport for officers accepting the capitulation of enemy forces. A Jeep famously drove General Douglas MacArthur onto the deck of the USS Missouri for the formal Japanese surrender ceremony that officially ended World War II. The humble vehicle carrying one of the war's most prominent commanders to witness the culmination of years of global conflict, symbolically outlasting all of the Third Reich's proudest weapons and most impressive military hardware. For German military personnel, particularly senior officers who had devoted their careers to understanding warfare and logistics, the Jeep represented both revelation and humiliation in equal measure. Their armies had dismissed it initially as a toy, a wasteful American excess that diverted resources from serious weapons systems, only to discover through painful battlefield experience that it was perhaps the most effective general-purpose workhorse vehicle any army had ever fielded. When von Arnim finally surrendered in Tunisia, when his forces were completely surrounded and out of supplies, and any further resistance would have been pointless slaughter, captured documents reveal that his staff officers asked their American counterparts one final question about the Jeeps that had so thoroughly outmaneuvered their forces. They wanted to know the actual numbers, the real production figures, seeking confirmation or denial of the statistics that seemed too extreme to be accurate. The American officers, tired from combat but pleased with their victory, reportedly laughed at the question, responding with something simple and devastating. How many? Enough. And that single word captured a truth that went beyond mere vehicle counts, that spoke to fundamental differences in industrial capacity and economic philosophy. America hadn't just constructed a motor vehicle, hadn't simply designed another piece of military equipment to add to their arsenal. They had built something that became a symbol of industrial might, a machine so fundamentally ordinary in its simplicity that it became extraordinary through sheer ubiquity and reliability. By the spring of 1945, with approximately 500,000 Jeeps distributed across the globe, operating on every continent where American forces had deployed, German generals who had survived the war's catastrophic conclusion understood the mathematics with brutal clarity. Each individual Jeep might be small, might be unimpressive when viewed in isolation, might seem like a minor factor when compared to heavy tanks or strategic bombers. But multiply that modest capability by hundreds of thousands of units, distribute them throughout an entire military force, and the cumulative effect became overwhelming. The conflict wasn't won exclusively with Tiger tanks and Panther tanks and other impressive fighting vehicles, wasn't decided solely by four-engine bombers and fighter aircraft, wasn't determined only by the grand dramatic weapons systems that filled propaganda photographs and newsreels. Sometimes the decisive victories came from something as seemingly mundane as a little four-wheeled utility vehicle that could travel anywhere, perform virtually any logistical task, and never stop running no matter how much you abused it, a machine whose very simplicity made it nearly impossible to keep down for long, whose standardization meant repairs could be made under any conditions, whose reliability meant commanders could make plans assuming the vehicles would actually be where they needed them when they needed them there. The broader lesson extended beyond military logistics into questions of industrial philosophy and economic organization. The German military machine, for all its tactical sophistication and operational brilliance, for all the individual courage of its soldiers and the tactical skill of its junior officers, operated within economic constraints that became increasingly severe as the war progressed. They fought with limited resources that had to be carefully rationed and allocated, accepting shortages as an inevitable aspect of their situation, developing elaborate doctrines for operating under constraint. The American approach rejected constraint as a governing principle, instead applying industrial capacity to eliminate limitations wherever possible, flooding potential bottlenecks with such abundance of resources that logistics ceased to be a limiting factor on operations. When you could provide every rifle squad with motorized transport, when you could evacuate wounded within minutes of injury, when you could reposition forces faster than the enemy could react, when you could maintain supply lines across hundreds of miles of terrain without creating vulnerable, slow-moving convoys, you fundamentally changed the nature of warfare in ways that tactical brilliance couldn't overcome. The Jeep's contribution to final victory wasn't flashy or dramatic, didn't involve heroic last stands or decisive battles. couldn't be captured in a single photograph or newsreel moment. Instead, it represented the grinding, relentless, ultimately unstoppable advantage that came from superior logistics and industrial capacity, the kind of advantage that accumulated slowly but couldn't be countered through cleverness or courage alone. Every time a German unit ran low on ammunition while American forces could call for resupply and have it delivered within hours, the Jeep was part of that equation. Every time German wounded died because they couldn't be evacuated quickly enough while American medics had immediate access to motorized transport, the Jeep was part of that calculus. Every time German commanders had to carefully husband their limited vehicle resources while American officers could dispatch Jeeps on tasks almost casually, accepting occasional losses because replacement vehicles were always available. The cumulative effect of that disparity grew larger. Looking back from the perspective of the post-war world, when military historians and strategic analysts attempted to understand how the Allies achieved victory against enemies who had often demonstrated superior tactical performance at the operational level, vehicles like the Jeep featured prominently in their conclusions. The simple, humble, almost comically unpretentious little machine that German intelligence had dismissed as impractical turned out to embody principles that were more strategically significant than any wonder weapon or secret project. Reliability mattered more than impressiveness. Standardization proved more valuable than custom excellence. Quantity possessed a quality all its own when pushed to sufficient scale, and the ability to rapidly produce and deploy basic but effective solutions created advantages that sophisticated but scarce alternatives couldn't match. The story of German General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim raising his field glasses that December morning in Tunisia and seeing those swarms of small vehicles bouncing across the desert represents a microcosm of the larger strategic reality. He was watching the future of mechanized warfare, though he didn't fully grasp it at that moment, observing the triumph of industrial democracy over aristocratic military tradition, witnessing the power of logistics to determine strategic outcomes as surely as tactical brilliance or operational art. Those toy cars that his lieutenant mocked were in fact the vehicles that would help carry Allied forces all the way to Berlin and Tokyo, maintaining mobility and support across distances and terrain that had defeated previous armies throughout history. When the final accounting of World War II was completed, when historians tallied the factors that contributed to Allied victory, the Willys MB Jeep earned its place among the decisive weapons not through devastating firepower or revolutionary technology, but through the simple, reliable, persistent excellence of being exactly what was needed, produced in quantities sufficient to meet every requirement, available wherever American forces operated, and capable of continuing to function under conditions that would have disabled more sophisticated alternatives. Enough, the Americans had said when asked about numbers. Enough to win, enough to supply, enough to support, enough to ensure that mobility and logistics would never be the limiting factors on operations. And in total war between industrial powers, that kind of sufficiency proved more valuable than any amount of tactical genius or individual heroism, grinding down opposition through relentless material advantage until victory became inevitable, not because of any single dramatic moment, but because the cumulative weight of industrial capacity made any other outcome impossible to sustain.